afternoon, everyone. It's Sky Moss here, and interviewing him today is Sloane Moss, his daughter. Okay.
Hi, Sloane.
No, hi.
Go.
Number
Harley,
one.
Get.
Oh, that's our dog, Harley. Okay. First one. Blacks in World War II.
So blacks in World War II. During the war, we mostly served in supportive roles. We did see some combat during the war. The 761st Tank Battalion was very famous. The Tuskegee Airmen wound up seeing combat in the Mediterranean and Southern Europe. They were known as the Red Tails because they painted the tails of their planes red. Back at home, the NAACP saw membership go from 50,000 to 500,000, and what was called the double V, victory against racial tensions and racial discrimination, and victory against fascism were two things that black people pointed towards. There were only 5 officers in the entire Army, 3 of them were chaplains, and the Marines and the Air Force didn't admit any blacks at all during that time.
Wow. How about the end of war?
So the end of war. The war came to an end in multiple stages. The invasion of Sicily by Allied forces was a big deal because eventually they used that as a stepping stone to get into Italy and pour into Europe. By 1945, the German machine was collapsing all around Hitler. The Battle of the Bulge took place that year. 70,000 American troops died in that battle. It was brutal fighting. It was incredibly cold. And also, after we defeated the Germans, it was actually the Russians who will storm Berlin. The Americans made it across the Rhine. We liberated a lot of concentration camps during that time, and then we turned our attention towards Japan. And so when Truman took over, when FDR died, he was told he had the most horrific weapon in the history of the world, and that was, of course, the nuclear bomb. He decided to utilize that weapon 2 times, once on Hiroshima, Japan, and then again on Nagasaki, Japan. The joint blast killed 140,000 people instantly, and then millions more died from fallout in the months that followed. That eventually led to Japan's surrender, and of course ended World War II.
Wow. Okay, how about the New World Order?
The New World Order is a term that I like to use. It was a wrestling group at one point, if you watch professional wrestling, but in this context, I'm referring to a post-World War II establishment of NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, that came to be very, very powerful. Now, this took place largely in the United States. There's a place called Dumbarton Oaks, also in New Hampshire and out west. And at these meetings, it was decided that the dollar would become preeminent and be more powerful than the pound. It was also decided the IMF, or International Monetary Fund, would be founded, as well as the World Bank.
Oh my God.
Add to that the formation of the United Nations, which was finalized in San Francisco, and you have this group of entities after World War II that don't follow any nation state. They are conglomerate ideas. They're NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who have vast power over the world going forward. And only today, in 2020, do we start to see some of that power being challenged from different entities.
Okay, next is Cold War Marshall Plan.
Cold War and the Marshall Plan. So the Cold War, many people call it World War III. It's a long war that is largely a proxy war. It's an ideological war between the United States and the Soviet Union. It lasted from essentially the end of World War II until 1989 or 1990. And although the Soviets and the United States, or the Soviets and the Americans, never directly fought, you did have fighting that took place in places like Afghanistan. Follow me with the camera.
Okay.
Afghanistan. Sloane dropped her prompt sheet.
Whoops.
She may be fired soon.
Sorry.
Angola, obviously Vietnam, Korea, Nicaragua. Across the world, Sovietism and Americanism battled during the Cold War. It manifested itself in Olympic Games, the Miracle on Ice that took place obviously with our hockey team. Sports, entertainment, nothing was exempt from competition between the Soviets and the Americans during the Cold War. So while it was cold on paper, it flared up on many occasions and led to a lot of violence and a lot of death across the world in the name of Soviet competition versus Americans.
Okay.
Come on, hit me.
Next on the list is 1948 to 1949.
1948, 1949. So in 1948, you saw a wall go up, quite literally eventually, in the city of Berlin. The Soviets are going to blockade the entire area and not allow the West to bring goods in. So like for 11 months, you saw Western countries air deliver supplies into the western portions of Europe. That's the point where the country delineated Berlin became the separation point. The Berlin Wall was built, and that separated the two countries. In 1948, NATO was founded, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was basically a gathering of Western countries that got together to protect themselves against Soviet aggression. In 1953, the Soviets countered with what they called the Warsaw Pact. And there were other big things that happened that year as well. So that was the same year, the same series of years that the Soviets successfully tested their first nuclear weapon. Once it was clear that the Soviets had nuclear weapons and we had nuclear weapons, brinksmanship was common. And so the Cold War was also this constant threat of nuclear destruction. It was very, very scary. Lastly, I would finish with, I'll give you two more. We began rebuilding Japan sincerely in 1948. General Douglas MacArthur was put in charge. We wrote their constitution. We gave women the vote, and we really transitioned their military economy and industrial complex at that time into an electronics capitalistic approach to economy, which is what you see today and what you saw throughout the 80s in Japan. And again, the last one this time for real, in 1949, Mao Zedong began what was called the People's Revolution. Most people call it the Communist Revolution in China. He rose and brought the army together. They challenged a guy named Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader at the time. The West loved Chiang Kai-shek, but Mao Zedong was too strong. He pushed Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist forces out of the mainland country into a place called Formosa. Today, many people call it Taiwan. The Chinese call it Chinese Taipei. And that Chinese revolution, that communist revolution in 1949, really led to the modern, powerful state of China that you see today. Hit me.
Korean War.
The Korean War took place from 1950 to 1953. During the course of that war, close to 30,000 Americans died. It was a brutal war. What happened was Japan occupied Korea during World War II. Now, after the war was over, the country was separated. The northern section was essentially given to the Soviets, the southern to the Western countries, mainly the United States, and then by 1948-49, the North invaded the South. They started to make great gains. So it was voted in the UN that we could intervene. The United States sent troops in, and we pushed the North Koreans back north all the way to the border of China. Then China jumps in. And so you got the U.S. fighting and South Koreans fighting against the North Koreans and the Chinese. And from 1950 to 1953, some brutally cold, horrific fighting took place on that border. At one point, it was suggested we should nuke China or use a nuclear weapon on China. Of course, that did not take place. And then eventually we had an armistice signed in 1953 that still exists today. So that war never ended. An armistice is just a ceasefire, basically. They set up a line called the 38th parallel, which separates North from South. And when we talk about North Korea today, under Kim Jong-un, who you might have seen, just had some pretty dramatic surgery and may be in bad shape. We really look to this point during the Korean War for where that separation began. Hit me.
Truman.
Harry Truman is from Missouri. He grew up in Kansas City politics. He was put on the ticket in 1944 with FDR, never with the intention of being president. FDR dies, suddenly Truman's president. He was kind of a mini FDR. His programs were called a fair deal. He believed in unemployment insurance, improving health care, working on housing. It's Truman that will desegregate the military, and he'll go a long way in trying to make the United States a more inclusive place. In 1948, he's running for the presidency, and part of his party defects a bunch of Southerners, frankly racist, led by a cat named Strom Thurmond. They wanted segregation, they didn't believe in integration, and so they formed their own party called the Dixiecrats. It looked as though Truman would lose that election. He ran against a cat named Dewey on the Republican side. Anyway, long story short, Truman wins that election, goes on to serve until 1952, and Truman's sort of life and presidency was really designated by getting us out of World War II, but then leading us into the Korean War. A lot of his programs were futuristic, though not many of them worked. Hit me. HUAC, the House on Un-American Activities Committee. It existed during the 1950s. It was a byproduct of the U.S. Congress. They were trying to find communists. There was a senator from Wisconsin. His name was Joseph McCarthy. And he began what was called McCarthyism, this absolute inquisition searching for communists in our midst. Nothing was scarier than a communist America in the 1950s. McCarthy will go so far as to accuse State Department officials. Some of them will actually be tried and convicted. He'll go on to actually accuse Army officers and those in the U.S. Armed Forces. That's kind of when his demise began. But the HUAC committee itself, it searched throughout Hollywood. It made guys like Walt Disney and Gary Cooper and Ronald Reagan come and testify to snitch on communists in Hollywood to try to get them to tell on who was down with the Communist Party there. I mean, ultimately, it was sort of reflected by the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were tried and convicted and sentenced to death and executed for selling nuclear secrets to the Soviets during that era. And a young Richard Nixon cut his teeth on that HUAC committee. Strangely enough, they also investigated Batman and Robin because they thought it had homophobic overtones. Go.
Okay, the last one is 1950s economy, agriculture, and suburbia.
So 1950s, you saw this dramatic change. The economy is going to profit and parlay World War II advancements, and so you saw things like cheaper commercial air flight, long-distance phone calls now became cheaper. Computers and electronics will now become more ubiquitous. We use a lot of the elements of war and the instruments of war and integrate them into our economy after this war. This is the time in America in the 1950s where we had the highest middle class rates. 60% of Americans are considered middle class during that time. And you see this real transition from blue collar jobs, if you will, to white collar jobs. By the end of the decade, 25% of female workers are clerical workers, and 60% of men working in industry or in major corporations will be salaried by the end of that decade. It does lead to some bad things for agriculture as I transition. You saw a decline in the number of farm families in the United States during the 50s. It dropped from roughly 23 million down to 15 million. You know, you can't make a living farming increasingly in that era. That's for a number of reasons: pesticides, insecticides. You know, corporate farming begins at that time. Even though the number of farmers and farms dropped, the yield went up by 50%. So we were producing much more. You know, a lot of those folks are going to abandon farm country, move into the suburbs, move into the cities, spread out across the United States. And so it's kind of a real sad chapter for agriculture in the 1950s in the United States. And the last piece is suburbia. And suburbia is this curious phenomena that takes place in the United States, where you saw massive numbers of white people leave the urban spaces of the country and move into the periphery, known as suburbia. Sociologists often refer to it as white flight when you saw those folks leave. And by the time you get to modern America today, there are more people living in suburbia than rural America and urban America combined. It is pretty amazing to conceive. A perfect suburban community was one called Levittown. It was on Long Island. It was a 1,200-acre potato farm that was transitioned into a suburban community. There were 10,000 homes built there with 40,000 residents, and there were twice as many homes in the United States in 1960 than in 1950. We built a lot of houses in the 1950s. Now, the sad reality is most of those suburban enclaves won't be open for people of color. Black and brown people aren't allowed. And what's even sadder is a lot of that building was subsidized with federal monies and low-income loans to people like the Levitt brothers who built Levittown. At the very same time in the U.S. in 1949, the Housing Act created close to 1 million projects for poor people in urban settings throughout the United States. They can be known as the projects, if you will, and they're associated today with massive poverty in urban enclaves across the United States. So the 50s brought great change. On my next video, I'm going to chop it up on 50s pop culture. We'll transition towards Eisenhower, look at that 1960 election, and move quickly into the 1960s. Peace, y'all.